So in our context of Colossians chapter 3, we remember that we started out with being raised or risen with Christ, and we talked about several things that we were to desire, to have affection for, to set our mind on. We talked about those things. We talked about some things we were to mortify. We talked about some things that we were to put away, and then we talked about some things that we were to add. And we're at the point now where we are talking about family relationships. And of all the things that we're to add and things to consider, family relationships would rank as high or higher than other things we've talked about. If we don't have a good family relationships, and we've not succeeded as we should have. And we talked last week about wives' responsibilities. We're going to talk this today, beginning with verse 19, about husbands' responsibilities and relationships to their wives, or the relationship to their wives. And as I said in verse 19, and then we'll talk about relationships of responsibilities of children toward their parents, and then the parents toward their children. And these are very important subjects to discuss, and we'll not be able to cover all that's taught and all that is needed, but we'll try to do the best that we can in the allotted time that we do have. Paul writes by inspiration in verse 19, "Husbands, love your wives and be not bitter against them." Other translations say, "Don't be harsh against them." There's a lot said about husbands loving their wives. And of course, we can go to 1 Corinthians 13 and we can get a catalog of what it means to love, or the characteristics of love. But we're going to talk specifically, or try to talk specifically about husbands loving their wives and what's involved in that. We've noted recently in our study, in verse 14, it says that charity or love is the bond of completeness. So if we lack this love, specifically here of husbands toward their wives, then we're not complete, because love in itself is the bond of completeness. And if we lack this in the marriage relationship, specifically of husbands loving their wives, and we have missed the mark. We missed it widely. It's specific and like no other love that's mentioned as far as human relationships. And it is described and demonstrated in various ways, as we will notice a few today. The first that we want to note is just a few pages back in the New Testament, in Ephesians chapter 5. And it doesn't seem long ago that we were studying this, but in Ephesians chapter 5, there's a lot said about this particular relationship. And beginning in verse 25, it says, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it." So that's pretty strong language there, to love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. He goes on and says that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that it should be holy and without blemish. We'll stop the reading there, because we don't change the thought, but we introduce additional thought with this relationship between husbands and wives, or specifically husbands loving their wives. And but here's the idea, first of all, that a husband's love for his wife is sacrificial. It's sacrificing oneself. I should sacrifice myself for my wife. And that's not only talking about, but I do believe including that I would be willing to sacrifice my physical life for my wife if it came to that point. But it's much broader than that. That's just what we talk about. Would you give your life for your wife? Yes, I would give my life for my wife, but it's more than just that. There's so many sacrifices that I should be making for my wife because of my love for her. We look at the reasons that Christ, it says, gave his life for the church, and we read those, and there are many ways that we should sacrifice ourself and for our wives, demonstrating our love for her, or because of our love for her, that we would sacrifice because of our love to her and or for her. And so I'll ask a question now. Can anyone think of a reason or a way that we would sacrifice, other than giving our lives for our wives, a way that we would sacrifice for our wives? Okay. We would put her needs, her physical needs, before our own. And that's broad in itself. I don't know who said that because I don't hear real well, but it's a good point. That, needs are broad. We would see that she would have something to eat. If we are hungry and we have so much to eat, we would sacrifice and see that she would have something to eat before that we would have something to eat. Physical, okay? We would want her to have the benefit of that physical need. So from a physical standpoint, we would sacrifice ourselves. We would give up something that we needed, that she might have what she needed before we met our needs. What about another way, another sacrifice that we would make for our wives because of our love for her? I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat that, sir.
Always seeking her best interest.
All right, we would always seek her best interest, and that, again, that's a broad, term, but her best interest, and so seeking her best interest, and everything that we do, we would want her to be in her best interest. That would go with what we just said, but in her best interest, in that we not only her best interest, but her interest, her best interest in that. Let me say this in conjunction with that. Women are different than men. And not just the way that we look. Sometimes, in some places, it might be hard to tell the difference. But, women are different than men, not just in the way that we look, in the way that men think, in the way that women think, their emotions. Women are more, well, let me just ask this. I don't want to control the class with just what I think. I've got several things written down here, but say from an emotional perspective, what are some ways that women are different than men, where their needs are different than men's? We'll talk about that in more detail as we get toward the end of the class. Or maybe how are they different? Are they different? I find that women are more emotional. I think God made women more emotional, that they might be different in that, this may not be the right comparison at this particular point, but, in dealing with children and raising children, women are to, in 1 Timothy 5, young widows are told to instead of being busybodies and so on, they're to marry, bear children, guide the house. It's in the makeup of a woman to have the ability, better than a man, to interact with children and to have that ability to maybe know how to deal with children at times better than a man would. They're more compassionate, they're more caring, they're more tender-hearted. I recall from this point of tender-heartedness with children in mind, I believe it's in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Now, 1 Samuel, I could look that up, but I believe it's in 1 Samuel chapter 1, where Hannah was married to Elkanah, and Hannah did not have any children. And this grieved her sorely, and so each year when they went, I take it was a feast day, they went up to the priest, went to Eli, and Hannah would be so upset that she would cry and she would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, this upset him because she was so upset. And we know the story how that she was there and she was praying, and Eli thought she was drunk. And when she had an opportunity to explain herself, and that's when she made I don't know if it was a vow or a promise or a commitment to give, if she had a child, she would give that child in service, to the Lord. And of course, Samuel was born, and she gave Samuel. But that showed her emotions, her tenderheartedness, something that a man can't quite relate to on the same level, in my opinion, that a woman can. So we need to understand that as husbands, we need to recognize that, and we need to put her needs in that regard before ours and do whatever we can. I believe his expression was that, I love you more than 10 sons. She didn't have any sons, but he said, I love you more than 10 sons. So there's this great sacrificial part of the love that a man has for his wife, that he is willing to sacrifice whatever he can to ease her pain, to ease her sorrow, to provide what she needs to the extent that he can. There's a verse over in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 32 and 33, and we'll not turn and read those, but just make reference to them. This is where Paul is telling the Corinthians that there's going to be a very difficult time. And in his remarks there, it's better at this time to not marry and to stay single as Paul was single, because of the great hardships that they're going to have to go through. And he makes the point here in verse 32 and 33 that if a man remains unmarried, then he can devote his time to his service to God. But if he's married, then he has to devote his time to his wife. Now, he's not suggesting that he would put his wife ahead of God, but he's making the point that if you marry, you make a commitment to your wife. And that commitment is going to be a commitment that you're going to have to put her needs above your needs. When you're a single man, you don't have to sacrifice. You can do what you want to do that puts you, that you put first, that you desire to do. I'm not talking about things that's wrong, but just things that you want to do. But when you get married, things change. The wife becomes, not ahead of God, but ahead of the man, as far as he's willing to sacrifice the things that he might have chosen to do things that would be for her benefit, for her good. Because of his love for her, he's willing to sacrifice those things that he might demonstrate his love to her. And not just because he wants to, but because the Bible says he is supposed to. He is supposed to sacrifice himself for her. Anyone else that you thought, anything else that you thought of, that a way that a husband would sacrifice for his wife?
Here you talk about it being different, husband and wife being different. Sometimes the wife, it seems like have more intuitive, where they can read people a little bit better than men. Maybe they're a little more leery of everybody.
Yeah.
Like that's, I guess you may call it intuition or whatever, but it seems like to me they have some special characteristics.
Definitely. I thought of another one that I had not written down, but I forgot it. But nonetheless, there's a lot of ways in which we would sacrifice our will, our wants, our desires to that of our wives. We sacrifice our time. The time that we have, we'll sacrifice that for our wife. And so there's a lot of different ways in which we would do that. Anyone else along that line as far as how we would sacrifice?
Gerald,
Yes.
as husbands, we think about, talking just about maybe sacrifice, bigger things, and that's fine, but sometimes the small things, that we might think is the right thing. Let's say let's just use a real life example. If you're painting the inside of your house and you think the husband thinks it needs to be blue and the wife thinks it needs to be pink, it needs to be pink. It does. We should, and that's a small scale, but it's a big thing sometimes in a house. So we don't really, as men, we don't really need to get our way and things like that. I don't think.
I think we could offer our opinion, but I believe you're right. I can see where that would, that would be a point of discussion and decision, but it is, I think, would fall in that realm. Let's go on a little bit further. Let's go down. We're still in Ephesians chapter 5, and verse 28 says, "So ought." Now, this brings us back. This "so ought" ties in with what Paul has just said in verses 26 through, 25 through 27. And he says, so ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself, for no man ever yet hateth his own flesh, yet nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. So this gives us a lot of insight in some things, but what we want to point out here, first of all, is that he that loveth his wife loveth himself. Verse 29, for no man ever yet hateth his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. So that is saying that his love for her would cause him to nourish her and to cherish her. And, women need affection. They need attention. They need to hear that that I love you, and they need it to be shown. They need to be cherished. And of course, they need to be nourished. And that is, I think, part of the love that a husband should have for his wife. And this is tied in with the entire text, going back to verse 25. And so when it says in verse 28, so then men ought to love their wives as their own bodies. And then it gets into verse 30, for we are members of his body and of his flesh and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall join to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. So there is, he says this is a great mystery, but it seems to be making a parallel here of the relationship of husband and wife in Christ and the church. And of course, outside of our relationship to Christ and the church, or to the church, then it'd be the marriage relationship. When we talk about institutions, the marriage relationship is a very close relationship. It's a very important relationship, and it is compared here to the relationship of Christ in the church. And so in that relationship, the similarities, one of the similarities here is that this idea of nourishing and cherishing it says, even as the Lord the church. So our love as husbands ought to be that of one of nourishing and cherishing our wives. And because then I said they're different. Wives and husbands are different. And husbands will fail quite often and quite frequently if they forget this principle. If they forget the principle that, we should love our wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. If we forget that sacrificial part of it, and if we forget this part here, that as Christ, it says in verse in verse 29, even as the Lord the church, for no man ever hated his own flesh, but nourished and cherished it, even as the Lord the church. So, and what's been said, what's under consideration, is that's how the husband ought to be toward the wife. He ought to cherish and nourish his wife. And so there's a connection, the relationship, the parallel to Christ and the church. And so women have those needs. They're different than men, and we as men will forget these very important principles, if we're not very, very careful in our love. We can say that we love our wives, but do we show that we love our wives? And do we really love our wives? We need to go back here to Ephesians and read these verses and ask ourselves, do we love our wives as Christ loved the church? Do we love our wives? Do we cherish and nourish our wives as Christ does the church? So these are important questions that we need to answer, because we seem to get away from that, and we've been married for a while and we don't do those things. We just we don't show that love. Maybe that love still is there, or should be there, and yet we let it kind of slip away, and we don't need to do that. And then we have another over in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. This, when we go to 1 Peter chapter 3, we usually focus beginning with verse 1 about how that believing wife, how she would convert her non-believing husband. We won't go down to verse 7, where it says, likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them, this dwell with your wife, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor to the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Now, it doesn't say anything there about love, but I believe that love would be involved, and that the relationship to be where it ought to be when we look at this verse. So the first thing it says, that we need to dwell with our wives according to knowledge. And when we dwell with them according to knowledge, that's according to understanding, according to that which we know, some things that we've already talked about and more. And it says, giving honor to the wife as unto the weaker vessel. So, first thing is, we talk about honor, and we may not really know what it means. We'll talk about it between children and their parents and next time we talk. But someone give us a definition of how you would describe the word honor.
Another word that you need to define, but I would say respect.
Okay, you'll have to say that again. That was Lee, wasn't it?
It was. I said it may be another word you want to define, but I would say respect.
Okay, respect. Okay, to honor would be to respect. What about any other words that you can think of that would go along with defining the word honor?
She would occupy a position of distinction.
Okay, and I put down esteem. So you think esteem and a place of honor would kind of go together? And in my research, I found where the word value, when you place value on something, the more value you place on something, the more you honor that. So here's the idea maybe of you placing value. But I like the idea of respect and the idea of esteem, and as Tim expressed it, as the idea of honor. So as it says here in verse 7, it says giving honor to the wife. And why do we do so? And it says, as unto the weaker vessel. There's been I've read a lot about this idea of the weaker vessel. The weaker vessel, most of it said because the wife is the weaker sex physically. Brother Sutton said time and time again that she's weaker in a lot of different ways. Weaker emotionally, more tender-hearted, etc. Some things I talked about, but about everything that I read and where I looked, it referred to being weaker physically, the weaker vessel, weaker physically. But be that it is as it may, that's really not the part that's under consideration. The idea is that we honor the wife. According to knowledge, we honor the wife, giving her honor as unto the weaker vessel. So here's a reason, here's a purpose. And it says, and as being heirs together the grace of life. So here's no doubt husband and wife that are both Christians. And so you do this because you've got this in common. The husband would do this, would give honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, because they're heirs of life. They're both, have an inheritance together, and this heirs of life. And I thought I wrote down the verse for that. Romans 8 and verse 17 talks about heirs, and then joint heirs with Christ. When we become Christians, and we have an inheritance that awaits us, and so we become heirs, and we become fellow heirs with Christ. And so we do this because we are heirs of Christ, being heirs together of the grace of life. And it says that your prayers be not hindered. So here's a great responsibility that husbands have. And look at the weight that's on this verse. If husbands don't do this, if they fail to act according to knowledge and not give honor to the wife as they should, seeing that she is the weaker vessel, whatever way that you want to look at that idea, and the fact that they're heirs together of the grace of God, if that's not brought into consideration, then their prayers will be hindered. And that is, having the opportunity, the privilege to pray, but yet if the husband fails to do his part, he can hinder their prayers. And so you say, well, we're talking about husband loving wives. Well, I think this would be where a husband would fail to show his love manifested if he fails to follow the instructions here given in verse 7 of 1 Peter 3.
Gerald,
Yes.
have you considered the idea of this expression, the weaker vessel, that it could be talking about simply that since the woman is in a position of submission to her.
Yeah, that was another thing too. Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. It's three things that I looked at: weaker physically, weaker from a emotional perspective, tenderhearted, more tenderhearted, etc., and then weaker because she is to submit to her husband. So the weaker vessel. And in those times, women did not have the rights and privileges that men had in general. We talked last week how that women are subject to men in general, and specifically to their own husbands. And so that would be a possibility that the weaker vessel would be from the perspective of being in subjection to man in general, or husband in specific. So that is, I didn't write that down. In fact, I didn't write much of anything down. It's just the point that I wanted to make. But that is certainly one. Any comment on that? ER, what do you think about that? Any comment? Okay. No comment. Well, can't believe that I got through that and the bell hasn't rang and so on. Anyone want to add anything to what we've talked about? It's very important that we maintain the love that God has given us as husbands to our wives, and these are some ways that I believe that are pointed out, especially in Ephesians chapter 5, that we need to adhere to. And yet I think that I fail to keep those principles in mind that, and I think, yes, I'd lay down my life for my wife, but what other sacrifices would I make? And when asked, I said, well, yes, I would do that, but am I showing it? Do I think about it and do I show it? Do I consider her like I ought to? And then from those considerations, do I make those sacrifices as I should? And, based on the importance of the marriage relationship as shown in those latter verses of Ephesians chapter 5. Yes, Rex.
A man should take on the hard stuff, whether it's heavy or it's hard emotionally or it's a hard problem like this with children. He ought to take this hard. He ought to take over those responsibilities.
Yeah, the hard stuff. Yeah, I've known, and Tim, I'll get to you in just a second. I think we'll have time, but I've known men that would have their wives work with them side by side doing man's work. That's not covered here in this. I mean, this is that would be a violation of this, I believe, this verse. Tim, please.
About man and woman in their role, we often refer to it as headship. I think the woman is relying on her husband to be who he's supposed to be. And in that sense, I think we may see the idea of the weaker vessel, like we look unto Christ. I think the wife looks to the husband for leadership and for guidance. If we don't love them and honor them, we can damage that relationship.
Well, part of this sacrificial is that we as husbands and being the head of the house, and which we didn't discuss today. We discussed that really last week, but this is the idea that this is the way that we would that we do sacrifice. We sacrifice. We have the responsibility to provide, so we sacrifice. Our efforts to provide the needs of our wife and our children, but specifically for our wives. And by the way, I did think about this. In case anyone, has young children, or will have younger children, it's not love your children, then love your wife. It's love your wife and then love your children. Now, there's different kinds of love, but when we talk about this, the relationship between the husband and wife comes first. And I'm not saying you mistreat your children. I'm just saying when you look at the organization of a family, you look at the husband, your wife, and children. And a lot of families have failed because the father, and it could be the mother as well, but here we're talking about fathers, they have a son or daughter, and the father is taken with that child, and that child becomes his new world. And the wife doesn't get the attention that she deserves and needs because the child has gotten it. Now, what you have to do is you have to balance and give, make sure the child gets the attention, but you cannot let that child take the place of your responsibilities, the love that's required in those sacrifices and that cherishing and nourishing that the spouse is to get. The child doesn't replace the wife. And I'm not trying in any way to say that we don't do our children good or do our children right. We just simply do what we do for our wives and show the love that we have toward them. We don't allow anyone or anything. Now, there are things, you don't come in from working 5 days a week and then spend Saturday playing golf all day. You know, I just don't see that how that you can cherish your wife and put her and sacrifice for her and put her first in your life and not ahead of God. In fact, if you do this, you're doing God's will. This is what God says. So what you have to do is to make sure you put your wife, your love for your wife, and what goes with that ahead of yourself and what you may want to do. Maybe you want to go fishing, and so you go fishing every Saturday, or you go fishing every afternoon, or whatever. You done gone and messed up, And I'm not saying you can't do some things, without your wife. I'm just saying you cannot let that slip. You cannot let that go undone. And there's things that you can do when your wife's around and still neglect to do what you're told to do about loving your wife and cherishing her and nurturing her and treating her the way that she needs to be treated as a woman because of the way that God made her, and our responsibilities to sacrifice to supply those needs and so on. But that's easy to do. And if we're doing that, we need to get back on track. It's not about me, it's not about me, it's about her. And if we learn that lesson, then we'll have a better marriage. We'll have a scriptural marriage. We're talking about unscriptural marriages. If we're not loving our wives and treating them and loving them as we've been taught in the Word of God, then we're not doing what we ought to do. And there's the bell. And I'm going to have to shape up now for sure.